The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazines. I'm a painter. I love to go to Europe and paint, and we're going to teach you today about painting European street scenes with the great John Michael Carter.
Hello, I'm John Michael Carter. Today I'm going to be demonstrating on the subject of architectural landscape. Specifically, we'll be painting a street scene today. Now I'll be using plein air methods to create this demonstration, although we will be using photo references in this particular case. If you look over here, our subject is a street scene in Arles, France. Arles is in Provence, France, and it's very typical of provincial cities in that area. It has very narrow streets, interesting eaves. In this particular case, a church with a nice bell tower and a wonderful green roof, and multicolored shutters, a lot of wrought iron for lamps, and rough street areas, and wet sidewalks in this case. Now, I would like to explain what first draws me to a subject. And quite often, just walking in an area, I'll notice shapes and contrasts and values which attract my eye. In this particular case, the strong contrast between the sky and the uneven eave lines create a very strong abstract value up against that clock tower. And it's very captivating to my eye. And in our demonstration, I will talk about how we can concentrate on essential elements that we first see when picking out a scene or being attracted to a particular scene, and how we maintain that through the painting and don't become confused by painting a lot of unessential details. So I'll be working from not only this photograph, but to my right we have the same image on a monitor, and it's a little larger, and I can see it a little more easily. It also, working from the monitor, gives one a little more the impression of actually being outdoors, because the intensity of the light is more realistic than in the photograph. If you'll notice, when looking at the photograph again, I have created two lines through the center of the photograph. One a vertical and one a horizontal. Now, that vertical line helps me to maintain vertical alignment in the buildings that I draw in, so that they're not leaning to the left or leaning to the right. And if you'll notice, looking at the photograph, especially near the edges, lens distortion creates bent lines so that you don't see verticals on these buildings to either side. So anyway, establishing that relationship helps me to create or correct those discrepancies from vertical as I paint the demo. Now I will establish those same lines on my canvas, and at a point where we're ready to begin. Now, first of all, though, I'd like to talk about my palette a little bit. This is just a titanium white, cadmium yellow pale, cadmium red deep, and then alizarin crimson, yellow ochre, transparent oxide red, then viridian green, manganese hue. I like to use that as a convenience color. And then we have cobalt blue. And essentially, those will limit ourselves to those colors. Now, actually, on my studio palette, quite often I will add more colors just for the sake of convenience, especially in finishing a painting. I like to be able to use accents of almost pure color. And so I like to keep a wide variety of hues on my palette. Now, I will begin by establishing a transparent tone on the canvas, and I'm going to use yellow ochre, cobalt blue mixtures thereof, one to the bluer side and a mixture a little more to the yellow side. And then just off to the side, I'm going to influence that with a bit of red to give a slightly warmer mixture. Now, these are all transparent. The only thing I'm going to add to these is turpentine. The lighter values that occur in our subject are toward the back of the toward the vanishing point in the perspective. So, in other words, when we look at our photo again, we have a situation in which we have one point perspective. That means one vanishing point, and that vanishing point will be on a horizon line, which is at about my eye level as I paint this, or as I photograph this. So, my eye level is going to be approximately the same level as the other people who are photographed in this painting. I assume they're approximately the same height that I am. Now, as our horizon line is essentially at eye level, the vanishing point will be more or less down through the middle of the street. And as we go down through the center, the values become lighter in our reference. So I will establish some tone to get away from a white canvas. It's much easier to judge subsequent values that I will apply if we don't have to do them on a white surface, especially since there really is nothing which is white in our reference. So I'll just begin with a tone like that, and then take a rag and a bit of turpentine, and I'll essentially wipe that down a little bit. We don't need to worry about being too precise with it, but I want it to be a bit darker to my peripheral edges. And then, as we move toward the center, we'll be a little lighter. Now, I'll leave that for just a moment. And then on the photograph, I want to discuss a couple of elements that we're going to have to establish. Now, we're essentially looking into what I would call a box. And what I mean by that is the facades on the left side, the building facades, form one side of the box. The building facades on the right side form another side of the box. The ground plane forms the bottom of the box, the sky plane the top of the box, and the back of the box is essentially the church and bell tower. So these elements also create strong diagonals. If you'll look at these little dark edges on the eaves as they work their way back along the curb of the street, on either side, strong diagonals are created which all go back toward our vanishing point. They essentially compel the eye to move back down the street toward our center of architectural interest, which is this church tower and some of the individuals walking down the street. So we want to be careful that we make a strong statement concerning these transition points or transition lines where the bottom of the box, the side of the box, the top, and the other side of the box come together. Now, I am going to recreate the horizontal and vertical line which I have on the photograph on my canvas, and I'm just going to use a little bit of dark paint to do that. And I've got a yardstick here, and I've already put a couple of points at the top and bottom of the canvas that allow me to establish a vertical line halfway through the middle of the canvas, and then also a horizontal line halfway through. Now, as I said, that gives me a reference for subsequent vertical lines that I'm creating in my architecture to help me make sure that I have them straight up and down and not leaning to the right or leaning to the left, or making the mistake of following some of the distortion caused by the lens of the camera, which causes the buildings, especially on the peripheral edges, to look like they are leaning in one direction or another. Most of the time they're going to look like they're leaning in. The other benefit to this is that I've divided the canvas into quadrants just like the photograph. And since we have quite a bit of measuring to do to establish our drawing, it's essentially like making a very simple grid and gives us some reference points to help establish our drawing accurately. I'm going to put on a pair of glasses here so we can see, or I can see a little better. And first thing I'm going to do is just establish some of those edges that I talked about that create the sides, the ground plane, the sky plane, and the back of the box. So I will do a couple of brief brush strokes which will help orientate where I'm going to do locations on these basic areas. Now on this side of the box we're actually down here a little lower, and we'll be coming out approximately like that. So now we've created a sky plane up here, which is the top of the box, and then we've created a perimeter here, which is going to, or division between side plane, which are the building facades to the left and the right, And now we want to find those on the bottom as well to establish our ground plane. And these strokes, for the moment, are pretty approximate, let's put it that way. So we'll be coming out something like that. And then, of course, the back of the box is going to be the church. And it looks like it makes it up about 2/3 here. Now, I will not attempt to paint things exactly as they are, and I really don't have a great interest in duplicating nature just as it exists. I like to edit and push shapes around, make them a little more to my liking, accentuate certain aspects in the values of the design, shape relationships, color relationships, in order to give the scene a little more impact than it may have without making any changes. Okay, and the ground plane sidewalk is going to be approximately here. Anyway, we want to establish some basic drawing lines now here, which have established side of the box, left side, right side, the sky plane, which is the top of the box, and now the ground plane, which is the bottom of the box. And as I said, the church essentially represents, especially because it has a facade which is perpendicular to us, the back of the box. All right, now we have value considerations to make, and then we have color temperature considerations to make. Now in this particular case, we have a rainy day, so we've got gray skies. We don't have a lot of warm sunlight, which is going to create cool shadows. So in this particular case, values are going to be a prominent consideration, especially since the difference between the lighter values and the darker values are going to establish those interesting diagonal shapes that are formed by the eaves of the buildings, some of the shutters, the contrast between sky and those eaves, and little dark elements which occur in the architecture. And as I said, they all tend to form diagonals which will carry us back toward the cathedral, which does have architectural interest in terms of its structure. So I am going to start out methodically creating some of the darker elements. In other words, I'll be using the eaves, some of the shutters, to establish these diagonal elements and the drawing at the same time. After I've done that, I'll be able to come back in and now worry more about color considerations in terms of warm and cool applications. So essentially it's going to be like doing a monochrome wash line drawing to begin with. Now I'm just using a small sable brush because we'll start with some of the background elements. And once again, I'm just using transparent mixtures of paint. We're using a little manganese mixed with the ochre. And when I want it to get darker, I can add a little burnt sienna to it. Some of the values that are toward the back, because of atmospheric perspective, I will keep those a little lighter, and as we work toward the closer structures, or those nearer to us, our point of view, will become a little darker. So I've got a broad mixture here. I'm even going to add just a touch of white to that last mixture. So I have a fairly pale mixture, but we still have quite a bit of turpentine in that, so it's still relatively transparent. Now I'm going to use my yardstick maul stick here to help keep my hand steady. And I'm going to concentrate very hard on these first applications of paint, or these first considerations in terms of the drawing. Now, I am going to go immediately into what is the center of the canvas. And that's, of course, where the horizontal and vertical lines cross. And I am going to establish a doorway which is right at that junction. So I can be fairly certain now that this is going to be an element which I have judged with some accuracy. Now, I don't think so much in terms of this being a doorway as I do just an interesting dark little shape. And I will follow that on down, something like that. There's a little piece over here, little edge back on that side. That now will come immediately up a vertical. And I believe the doorway is actually in that building. So I'll come straight up to the overhang above that. And that comes just past my vertical reference here. And I'll begin blocking in these dark shapes. Now I squint at my photograph just like I would if I were working outdoors. And the main reason is I want to separate light and dark values from one another. And so to get rid of all those middle tones, I squint, and therefore values either tend to be in the light or they tend to be in the dark. And that simplifies what I'm looking at so that it becomes a little more of a pattern. All right, now it's important that we look for shapes. And what I mean by that is don't allow yourself to be lured into the idea of painting things. And what I mean by that is don't paint what you think an eave looks like, or the gutter of the roof looks like, or what you think a window may look like. But you want to look carefully at the shadow shapes which are created from these elements and think of them as small abstractions and try to paint them in as abstract shapes. And you will see as I develop these shapes that we don't really have any true rectangles or true symmetrical shapes, but a lot of small abstracted pieces that as a whole will combine to give the overall feeling of the architectural elements without specifically being a rendering of a door or a rendering of a window. Let me see, just a touch of the side of the cathedral over here as it goes away into the distance. And then that works its way down into a dark. And that comes up. And then we have a little horizontal element, some type of architectural detail. Now we have a narrowing of the building at this point as we work up to the bell tower. And a shape that works off over here to this side. Now, the facade of the next building comes up here to just above that little roof line I just established in the church, and then the next overhanging eave will be right above that. And there's actually one below it as well. Let's go ahead and put that in. Now we want to be careful to keep in mind, as I said, that we have a vanishing point which is occurring someplace down approximately in this area back in here. So these lines, or these diagonals, will be heading in a direction which would be to that vanishing point someplace down here. So you want to make sure that you keep those relatively accurate to what they should be doing. Now I don't think it's necessary in a situation like this to establish a detailed perspective drawing in order to carry out a subject like this, but it is important to keep in mind that we do have elements of perspective involved, and that you want to maintain as much accuracy as you can when laying those in. And we'll begin to establish roof line on the tower itself. There's another little roof which comes out over here to the left. And then there's one as well to the right side. And then right next to the center line of the painting, we see the one on the forward side of the roof. So there's a little eave there with an opening and another little roof, and that'll have a little bit of a cast shadow beside it. And then you can actually see the opening of the window there, and that'll be darker. So we'll begin putting a bit of a shape in, like that. And there's an ornamental element to the top. We'll establish approximately where that is. Okay, so we're establishing a shape for that bell tower. Now I'm going to take a little artistic license here and remove a bit of a building. If we want to look at our photograph for a moment. On this particular side of the tower, I feel like it would be a little more interesting if we could see a little more sky just to that side. So I'm going to eliminate a little bit of the building over here, which I don't think anyone is going to notice, in order to create a space that some of that sky will fit into. And I'll just go ahead and find a shutter which is coming out from the top of the facade to the right, and then establish that. And then there's a eave just above that shutter. And there's another that comes from just beside that. And then from right up of what is the top of our canvas, we'll find that last eave. And another smaller one just below and between these two elements. Now that establishes, to a certain degree, that first diagonal that comes in from the right, from the upper part of the canvas, and forms that division between the sky plane and the side that forms the top of our box, and then the facades which form the side of our box. Now we'll come over to the other side and begin establishing that diagonal. Use a little bit cooler tone back here. There's some buildings just past the cathedral. I'll establish where those are. And then the facade of this building extends up to about here. And now once again we have an eave overhang. And actually the little shape of a gutter comes down from that. We'll go ahead and put that in. That roof extends back, and just beside that is the next overhang, and that will extend up above the height of the church tower. Check my negative shapes in here, make sure they approximate what I'm actually seeing. And then there's actually a shutter which gets in the way here, which sticks out, and a dark behind that. Now what this does is give us a pretty good pattern for where we're going to place more finished brush strokes later on. And a lot of these darks will just be incorporated into the shadow areas of the painting, and some of them may never be touched again. And that's why it's important to keep them fairly transparent, not add a lot of opacity to those areas. Get that where it's supposed to go. It's very simple. If you place something in an area where you don't want it, just take a rag with a little terps and remove it. So there's no reason to commit yourself to a mistake. Once you've established that something's in the wrong place, take the time to correct it. Don't think you're going to solve it at a later stage in the painting. So we move along very methodically. You have two shutters here which extend just down to approximately here. Another one just above that. And we'll actually have a small wrought iron post, and there's a sign which is attached to that, so that gives us a convenient little rectangular shape that we can place in here. A little dark that runs right down to that. And one beside it. And as I said, these all combine to make kind of abstract elements that begin developing these dark diagonals that work their way toward the horizon line of the painting. Over here to the left, I have a little figure with an umbrella that I'm going to introduce. This is a lady wearing a coat. So she'll just be a small, dark, abstracted shape for the moment. Try to avoid making her too symmetrical, so we'll allow the coat to stick out to one side. Let's see. I think I'm going to move her a little bit. Placed her a little higher in the composition than I wanted, so that she would be too tall if she were in that position. So I'll move her down here a little bit. But at the moment, she just becomes part of a dark that establish these diagonal planes, or diagonal these diagonal shapes that we're beginning to develop that move us back toward the horizon line. And we have another fellow with an umbrella. We'll tilt that the other direction. He's closer to us. And he's down on street level, so he's a little lower than she is. And he establishes a slightly larger dark shape. His feet will be down here approximately. And he's got his arm in his coat pocket, and his coat is flaring out behind him a little bit over here, so we'll be sure and catch that shape. A couple of dark elements that occur beneath our figure over here. We're beginning to introduce another diagonal shape moving into the picture plane on the left side. This is to begin establishing a transition between the ground plane and the facades of the building which form the side of our box. Now, next to our little fellow that we have right here in the center of the canvas, we have to have a parked automobile. I don't see any reason why we need to avoid that. I don't like to have too many in a scene, but they are a reality when you are looking at European streets. Well, a reality in any city these days. But we will establish the location of that and make it part of this diagonal consideration coming in on the right side of the canvas, which will establish where the ground plane and side planes meet. We'll begin completing the curb to this right side I'll establish a couple of darks for doorways over here. Keep in mind that we want to keep these horizontal elements, which have perspective considerations. In other words, they have tops which tend to recede toward the horizon. Make sure that you're not getting those out of alignment. And we'll continue to add some of these darker elements, trying to keep them as simple shapes. I'm not overdrawing. I'm trying to be accurate about my location of the shapes, but in terms of their rendering the individual shapes, I'm keeping them fairly simple, especially at this moment. Now you'll notice that almost the entirety of this beginning I've been doing with a small round sable brush. And as I lay in these transparent tones, I'll be using a couple of different flat sables, or not flat sables, but flat mongoose hair brushes. And but that's because the consistency of the paint I'm using is quite thin. Lots of turpentine, not much opacity to it. As we finish our drawing and establish these dark elements, I will switch over to using bristle brushes. There's a filbert. I have a number of different filberts and flats that I will use, and they're a little better for applying thicker applications of paint, and then to soften edges at the latter stages of the painting, I'll introduce some of the softer mongoose brushes in order to blend edges, soften edges a little. The canvas I am using here is actually a portrait linen, and it's a number 12 Classens. And it works very well for doing small landscape work. And when painting outdoors, I very rarely paint on a large format, so a fairly fine linen works very well for doing these small plein air studies. It has enough tooth that it isn't too slick, and at the same time it's not so much tooth that it's hard to cover up easily. Now, a lot of these considerations I have made at the beginning of the painting were very linear, and a lot of that is location, making sure that I get proper placement of the elements that comprise the composition. I picked up still a soft brush, a mongoose hair brush, but this is a small, flat, and it will cover a little more area with some of these wash tones, make it easier to make some bigger shapes. And I feel confident now that I can put those in because I've done enough linear work that the locations that I've established for some of the window areas, the doorways, some of the eaves of the building is now going to be accurate enough that I can make bolder applications of paint, cover more faster, but be fairly confident that I've got an accurate placement. So in other words, it's important to get those initial elements put in accurately so that as you put in subsequent shapes, you can locate them faster and put them in a little more bold, with a little more of a bold type of brushwork, and the painting process itself begins to speed up. Okay, I will continue now adding elements, and I keep in mind that I want to continually enhance these diagonal relationships between the sides of my box and the bottom of the ground plane, bottom of the box, and emphasize darks that reinforce those ideas, these diagonals that are created into the canvas. They help to reinforce the perspective, and from a design point of view, they start to create interest for the eye. Now, as you remember, when I put in my initial wash, I established some darker values toward the edges, allowing the values to appear lighter as we transition toward the back of our box. So I'm going to reinforce those values a little bit as I work toward the periphery of the canvas here. I want to move the location of a particular doorway a little more to the right than I had it. That'll mean adjusting this next doorway a little bit. Once again, I'll correct that just by using a little turpentine on a rag and removing some of those elements. Starting to establish some of the sign shapes. There's a rectangle, another rectangle for location of a sign. There'll be a street light above that. And then on this side, the left side of the canvas, as you can see, I'm also beginning to introduce an environment of different or darker values back here as well. So we start to create an atmosphere of light toward the back of our scene and darker values toward the front. And this is all as a support structure for subsequent applications of thicker paint that we're going to be placing on our canvas in our next step. Sidewalk here, and that'll help to reinforce that strong diagonal coming in to the painting from the bottom side, bottom left. And even at this point, on the street itself, we have some very light reflections occurring, from rain, which is collected toward the gutter. And we'll use that as an element that will walk our eye into the painting as well. Establish a set of shutters on this building beside this eave that helps to reinforce this diagonal design element, bringing all this together a little more. And I look for any excuse to reinforce that feeling of the diagonal coming in. Now I don't want to turn it into just a straight line. I want to make it as interesting as possible, so I find as many accumulated shapes as I can. And collectively, I hope they work as an overall diagonal moving in to our picture plane. And in turn, these create strong impetus for the eye to travel back into the picture plane. Few more elements, and then we will have essentially created a block-in that will provide the skeleton on which I can hang opaque applications of paint, and feel fairly confident that each of those applications is going to be pretty much in the correct placement. It's much easier to change these transparent applications, of course, than it is to come back and try and rework areas that are developed in opaque paint. It's much harder to scrape them off and not have the color that you put down influence subsequent colors that go on top of it. So it's much better to get these drawing problems solved in the transparent stage when they're easily corrected. Suggesting a wrought iron lamp which hangs out on the street. Little elements like that will help contribute to the realism of the scene as we progress. Pick up this small brush again and put that element in the clock tower here, or not the clock tower, the bell tower, excuse me. Go ahead and place the dark where that occurs. Take a quick look here to see if there's anything else I want to, any shapes I want to kind of make notations of to make sure that I don't miss them as I apply thicker layers of paint here in a minute. Do a quick bit of cleanup, and we'll be pretty well established with our block in and ready to proceed with some finish painting. And hopefully have the confidence that we'll be able to place our brush strokes pretty accurately. I'm just simplifying a little of this with the end of the paper towel. As you can see, most of these shapes all obey laws of perspective in terms of heading toward the vanishing point. My verticals are fairly vertical, but nothing is really overly rendered in terms of being a doorway or being a window. It's all suggestive shapes which at this point I want to seem organized but not be so particular that they become more important than the idea of creating these diagonal considerations which lead the eye into the painting. Basically, I want them to work as more or less abstract shapes. Now, the next step is that I'm going to clean my palette, check on all my colors, make sure that they're replenished, and then we will proceed with direct painting. And use opaque mixtures of paint now, and we'll talk a little more about color temperature and the color considerations that I'll make as I develop values in thick paint in the canvas. Hello, I'm John Michael Carter. Today I'm going to be demonstrating on the subject of architectural landscape. Specifically, we'll be painting a street scene today. Now, I'll be using plein air methods to create this demonstration, although we will be using photo references in this particular case. We have a situation in which we have one point perspective. That means one vanishing point, and that vanishing point will be on a horizon line which is at about my eye level as I paint this, or as I photograph this. So my eye level is going to be approximately the same level as the other people who are photographed in this painting. I assume they're approximately the same height that I am. And as we go down through the center, the values become lighter in our reference. So I will establish some tone to get away from a white canvas. It's much easier to judge subsequent values that I will apply if we don't have to do them on a white surface, especially since there really is nothing which is white in our reference. So I'll just begin with a tone like that and then take a rag and a bit of turpentine, and I'll essentially wipe that down a little bit. Use a little bit cooler tone back here. There's some buildings just past the cathedral. I'll establish where those are. And then the facade of this building extends up to about here. Now I want to develop more of the darks that are in this area of the painting and then bring that into a diagonal type of shape that works its way down through the lower part of the painting and helps bring this side of the painting, or bring the eye into the painting from this side. So I'm going to get a little more interest up here near this roof line. Add some color interest up there. Perhaps add to the complexity of the roof line itself up there. We actually have another section of roof up there that we could see.
Well, that was John Michael Carter painting European street scenes, and you can learn more about it at lilyartvideo.com. Remember, there's a special discount code for his video in the comments section. Thank you for watching.